A couple of years, about 2 years ago, I got an invitation, it's appropriate that Joan is here, from Joan Petersilia and Jim Wilson, to write a piece on reviewing the evidence on what we know about deterrence for a volume that they've been putting together. And it got me thinking again about this whole question. And it led to, after having completed that review, a collaboration with Steve Durloff, who's an economist at the University of Wisconsin, and we wrote a series of papers, one of which is called Imprisonment and Crime Can Both Be Reduced, which is going to be appearing in Criminology and Public Policy. So getting to actually the name of the paper, Imprisonment and Crime Can Both Be Reduced, I'll give you an answer to the question. Steve and I conclude that yes, in all likelihood, both can be reduced. But for us to achieve that reduction, we're going to have to shift away from what we call severity-based policies, an emphasis on lengthy prison sentences, to what we call certainty-based policies. As an operational matter for the country as a whole, what that's going to require is a shift of resources from corrections, we think, to policing. So now I want to fill in, use the rest of my time to fill in this conclusion. As a backdrop for all of this, I think this slide is something that most of us here are well aware of, and it shows the dramatic rise in prison populations in the United States, which began in the early 1970s. And between the early 1970s and the present time, the imprisonment rate, that is in federal and state prisons, has increased fivefold. And if you include people who are housed in the nation's jails, then we're now at a point where close to 1% of the adult population is incarcerated. And there's been much commentary about the social and economic costs of the very high imprisonment rates in the United States. And so in this context, Stephen and I began thinking about the question of whether it was possible for us to have both less imprisonment and less crime, and how you would go about doing that. So as a backdrop on this, let me just note some of the different ways in which imprisonment conceivably will prevent crime. One is by incapacitation. Another is by something which criminologists call specific deterrence, and it refers specifically to the effect, and I emphasize, the experience of imprisonment on reoffending. And I emphasize that in a medical mode, we would think of this as a treatment, the actual experience of it. And I just finished a review of the evidence on this with Frank Cullen, who's actually this year's Sutherland Prize winner, and a former graduate student, Cheryl Johnson, on the evidence on specific deterrence, which I'll be referring to in a moment. And then finally, the topic which is the focus of much of this paper and the paper that we wrote for Joan and I wrote for Joan and Jim Wilson, is on the topic of what criminologists call general deterrence. And here, general deterrence is about the effect of the threat of punishment on reoffending. And as I've indicated on this slide, I've just completed some recent reviews of that evidence. So, a couple of key constructs that are important to keep in mind when we think about deterrence. One important component, going back to Bentham, is the severity of punishment. And in the context of the American and criminal justice system, and indeed in the context of the criminal justice systems of most Western countries, that's mostly about sentence length. The other important idea in deterrence theory is what is called the probability of imprisonment given crime, which in the academic jargon is called the certainty of punishment. And in this regard, the police play a crucial role. Absent, that is, they're on the front line of creating certainty of punishment. and by the threat of apprehension. And I would in fact argue that they're the most important figures in creating certainty of punishment, although prosecutors and judges are also relevant as well. When we think about the role that police play in crime control, I think it's very important to distinguish two very different roles of the police. One is, which I think is the one that's most commonly think about, is the role of police in capturing criminals. And so you have things like the clearance rate and so forth in measuring that. But there's also, and I think this is the most important role of the police in preventing crime, is preventing crime in the first place. And I think this is what's happening, for example, with hotspots policing. And but a very concrete example of that is that if a policeman is standing or sitting in a police car in front of a liquor store, nobody in their right mind is going to try to rob that liquor store. And so what they've done is, by posing a threat of apprehension, they've stopped a crime from happening in the first place. And if there's no crime that happens in the first place, there's nobody that you need to punish. So some key findings from the reviews that we've done of the deterrence literature. In the context, and I want to emphasize this, in the context of the American criminal justice system, there is very little evidence that increasing already lengthy prison sentences has much of a deterrent effect. The other key point that emerges from the literature is with the right deployment of police, the police can have a very substantial deterrent effect. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this in the presence of this audience, because I think that some of the most convincing evidence on this point has been done by Larry Sherman, David Weisbert, and other folks here at George Mason. And I think this is very, very important research. And then finally, that there's little evidence of a specific deterrent effect. Remember, I was talking about the experience of punishment have a deterring effect. Indeed, the conclusion of the review that I wrote with Frank Cullen and Cheryl Johnson was that, on balance, the evidence, in fact, was pointing to a criminogenic effect. But that's, I don't want to emphasize that too much at this point. There's a lot more research on this point that's needed. Some key concepts that I want to, though, talk about is, first of all, that deterrence depends on the interplay of certainty and severity, and that also, 2 points, that deterrent effects are not homogeneous. And the reason I want to emphasize these points is that in discussions of deterrence, often, at least in academic circles, is that you hear conclusions stated like things like certainty matters but not severity. It's important to recognize that both are required. That severity without certainty can't deter, and conversely, certainty without any consequence can't deter. Peter, as an in the short time, we don't have time to get into it, but I will just relay a dinner time conversation I was having with Peter last night about the historical evidence in Britain, where in the 17th century or the 18th century, almost any crime you can think of was punishable by death. But juries were unwilling to impose these penalties, so instead they shipped people off to the United States, and then after we rebelled, they shipped them off to Australia. But you do need both, and I'll talk about that briefly more. The other point I want to make is that deterrent effects are not homogeneous, and part of the reason I want to emphasize this, what I think is a seemingly obvious point, is that so much of the debate, at least in academic circles, often comes down to mostly criminologists saying deterrence doesn't work, and mostly economists saying deterrence always works. And the fact of the matter is that the deterrent effects are not homogeneous. That is, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so, for example, the first conclusion I indicated was that on the margin, given current severity levels in the U.S., certainty does appear to have a stronger deterrent effect than severity. But just as important, as I was also discussing, is that police are at the front line of creating certainty, but that, getting back again to the important work of police researchers, what their research shows, and this again will be a surprise, not a surprise to anybody here, it depends on how the police are used on whether there's a deterrent effect. So, for example, there is large amounts of evidence, again, assembled by people in this room, that things like hotspots policing and problem-orienting policing do have substantial deterrent effects, but that so-called standard model tactics don't seem to. So it's important to keep in mind that these effects, just like in medicine, our medical treatment effects are heterogeneous, so are the effects of what we do to affect crime. A couple of comments about crime control and imprisonment. And this gets back to, these are points I want to make here, get back to this, go to the heart of the title of our paper. If you're going to control crime by incapacitation, crime control with incapacitation necessarily, logically, requires increased imprisonment. That's the only way you're going to reduce crime, is by putting more people in prison. And indeed, if one doesn't believe in deterrence at all, that's an argument actually for mass incarceration, because that's the only way you're going to control crime with sanctions.